I was parked outside the 24-hour gas station off the 210 with the engine running and the wipers on low when the ride request came through around 2:30 in the morning. Rain had been falling steady since midnight, the kind that soaks through your jacket if you step outside for more than a minute, and I had already done 8 hours at the clinic plus another 4 behind the wheel, so my eyes felt like sandpaper, but the fare looked decent enough to justify one more trip before calling it. Pickup was listed in Arcadia on a side street I recognized from other late runs, and the destination was up in the San Gabriel foothills, some address that the map showed as a turnout near the National Forest boundary. Passenger name showed Sarah Klein. I hit accept and headed over, telling myself it would be quick, and then I could crash for a few hours before my day shift. She was standing right at the curb when I pulled up, a woman maybe mid-40s wearing a plain dark jacket with the hood up and jeans that looked wet at the cuffs like she had been waiting longer than the app said. No suitcase, just a small purse slung over her shoulder. She climbed into the back seat, closed the door quietly and said, "Thanks for coming out in this." I told her it was no problem and started the route, the GPS guiding us onto the freeway, then off onto the canyon road that begins the climb. The rain picked up a little as we left the city lights behind, and the turns got sharper with the fog starting to hug the edges of the pavement, so I kept my speed down and my hands at 10 and 2 the way I always do when the visibility drops. For the first stretch, she stayed quiet, just looking out the window at the dark shapes of the hills and the occasional house light far off through the trees. After about 15 minutes, she leaned forward a little and asked if I drove nights a lot or if this was extra on top of something else. I said I worked days as a nurse aide at a place in Pasadena, handling the heavy patients and the paperwork, and that the Uber money helped cover the gaps, especially after everything with the divorce. She nodded slowly and said that sounded exhausting, dealing with people at their lowest all day, then turning around and ferrying strangers through the dark. I shrugged and said, "You get used to the routine, the way the body just keeps moving, even when the mind is somewhere else." She asked how long I had been doing the nursing, and I told her almost 8 years now, and she made a small sound like she was thinking about that. Then she said her brother had done shift work 2 long nights behind the wheel, and it wore on him the same way the quiet hours, letting your thoughts get too loud. I glanced in the mirror at that because something in her tone felt off, like she was leading somewhere but not pushing. She went on saying he used to talk about how one bad decision at the end of a long day could change everything, and that he had been coming home from a warehouse job one night when it happened. I asked what happened, keeping my voice even, because the road was demanding all my attention with the rain streaking the glass and the curves coming faster now. She said he was walking along the shoulder near Fontana because his own car was in the shop, and a vehicle came up fast, swerved a little maybe from fatigue or distraction, and hit him, then kept going without stopping. The words landed heavy in the car, and I felt my grip tighten on the wheel because that stretch of road, I knew it well. I had driven it hundreds of times, and the date she mentioned without me asking was 4 years ago, almost to the week. She kept talking in that same calm, steady way, like we were discussing the weather or the price of gas, saying the man never got out to check, just left her brother lying there with a broken leg and internal bleeding, and it took another driver almost 2 hours to notice him in the dark. I wanted to say something to change the subject, but my mouth felt dry, and the only sound was the wipers and the tires hissing on the wet asphalt. She said his name was Carlos Rivera, and he had been 42 with 2 kids who still asked about him sometimes, and a sister who had spent years trying to find the person responsible because the police never got a plate or a description good enough to matter. I kept driving, focusing on the yellow line, because if I looked back at her, I was afraid my face would give something away the way my stomach was twisting. And the memory of that thump under the tires that night came rushing back uninvited, the way I had told myself it was probably just a pothole or an animal until I saw the news the next day and realized what I had done. She said she didn't hold it against the driver. Not really, that panic makes people do things they would never admit, and that carrying it alone must be its own kind of weight, especially when you spend your days trying to help people stay alive. I muttered something about how accidents happen and that I hoped they caught whoever it was, but she didn't let it drop gently, telling me details I had never shared with anyone. The color of the car I was driving that night, a silver sedan with a dent on the passenger side from a separate fender bender the month before, the exact timestamp from the traffic camera a mile back that caught a partial plate, the way the driver had slowed for a second, then sped up like he couldn't face what he had done. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out how she could know any of this because I had sold that car 2 weeks later for cash, and never spoke a word about it, not to my ex when she asked why I was so distant, not to the bartender I used to see, not even to the priest at the church I stopped going to after the third sleepless month. The road climbed higher now, the fog thicker, so the headlights barely cut 20 feet ahead, and I could feel the sweat gathering under my shirt even though the heater was off. She asked if I ever thought about that night, and I said every time I get behind the wheel after midnight, which was true, but I didn't say the rest about how I'd started checking the rear view more than necessary, or how I avoided that stretch of road near Fontana, even if it meant longer routes. She said she understood that kind of quiet guilt, the way it sits in your chest, and makes every passenger look like they might be connected somehow. I found myself talking more than I meant to, rambling about the divorce and how my ex said I was never really there anymore, the way I would wake up at 3 in the morning sweating from dreams where the man was still alive and waving me down from the side of the road. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished she said softly that it must feel like carrying a passenger you can never drop off, and that some people spend their whole lives trying to outrun something that is already in the car with them. We were more than halfway up by then, the houses gone, and nothing but trees and guardrails and the occasional turnout where hikers park during the day. I kept glancing at the mirror trying to see her face clearly, but the interior light was off, and the dashboard glow only caught the edge of her jaw. She told me more about Carlos, how he whistled old ranchera songs when he was nervous, how he had promised to take the kids fishing the weekend after that night, and how the family had moved twice, trying to get away from the memories, but the questions never stopped. I felt something loosen in my chest for a second, like finally saying it out loud to someone who already knew made the weight shift a little. But at the same time it terrified me, because this woman had tracked me down somehow, found my name, my routines, my schedule, and chosen this ride to sit in my car and lay it all out without raising her voice once. The GPS announced we were 2 minutes from the destination, and the road leveled out into a wide gravel area with a chain across one end and a sign warning about no overnight parking. I pulled in and put the car in park, the headlights cutting across the empty space and the drop-off beyond where the canyon fell away into blackness. She sat there for a moment, then said thank you for the conversation, that it had helped more than she expected, and that sometimes you just need to see the person face to face to let something go. I asked if she was sure this was the right spot, because there were no houses, no lights, just the forest and the mist, and she said yes, this is where she needed to be. She opened the door, stepped out into the rain, and walked a few steps toward the edge, her boots crunching on the gravel. I waited with the engine running, figuring she might have forgotten something or needed to make a call, but she just stood there looking out over the valley for maybe 30 seconds, then turned, gave a small nod like she was acknowledging me one last time, and walked off along the dirt path that led into the scrub and the trees, the darkness taking her after about 20 feet, so that even the taillights didn't reach her anymore. I sat there for another 10 minutes or so, calling her name once or twice out the window, but the rain swallowed the sound and there was no answer, no movement, no phone light, nothing. Finally, I put the car in drive and started back down the mountain the whole way, my mind turning over every word she had said and how calm she had been, like she had planned the entire thing. When I got home, I checked the app and the ride showed as completed with a generous tip and no issues, but I couldn't sleep. The next day, I looked up Carlos Rivera and found the old articles, the photo of him smiling in a warehouse uniform, the quote from his sister Sarah at the memorial service, and it all matched what she had told me. I tried searching for her name too, but there wasn't much, just an old address and a social media profile that hadn't been updated in years. 2 weeks later, when I finally opened the Uber history again, the passenger name for that ride had changed to Carlos Rivera. The profile picture was the same news photo, and there was a 5-star rating with a comment that read, "Closure at last." I stared at it until my eyes hurt, telling myself it had to be a glitch or some kind of hack, but the payment had cleared and the trip details were still there. Since then, the requests have started coming in the app, showing a pickup at that same gravel turnout late at night, no passenger listed. But when I arrive, the ride begins anyway, and ends a few minutes later with payment from the Carlos Rivera account and no one ever there. I have driven up 3 times now, sitting in the car with the engine off, watching the spot where she walked off, feeling the rain on the roof and the weight in my chest getting heavier each time. I still do the day shifts at the clinic because the bills don't stop, but the night driving has become something I can't quit, even though I know I should. Other passengers seem normal enough, but every time I pick someone up, I find myself studying their face in the mirror, wondering if they know too, if they are connected somehow. I missed a shift last week because I spent the whole night parked at that turnout waiting for something I can't name, and when I finally drove away, the app pinged again with the same empty ride. My ex called yesterday to ask why I sounded so off, and I almost told her everything, but the words wouldn't come out right. I am typing this now at 4 in the morning on the library computer because my phone died and I can't sit in my apartment anymore without feeling like the walls are listening. The dread is not loud, it is just constant, like the rain that night, steady and soaking through everything, and I keep wondering if she is still out there walking those trails, or if she found her own way to end the waiting, or if the next time the app lights up, it will be her name again or his. I do not know how much longer I can keep going like this before the roads start to feel like they are closing in. But for now, I keep accepting the rides because stopping would mean admitting that the passenger I dropped off that night never really left the car at all. I was standing on the curb outside the laundromat that never closes on Colorado with the app already open and the request confirmed for a silver Camry because I needed to get up to that pullout off the Angeles Crest where the road widens and then just drops off with no guardrail for about 30 feet. And I had been picturing it for weeks now after everything stacked up: the layoff, the emails from Sarah, the texts from Mark that stopped coming, the rent notice taped to my door the way my mom kept calling, and I kept letting it go to voicemail because what was I supposed to tell her that wouldn't make her drive down here and see how bad it had gotten? For days, I had been walking around the apartment, not really eating, just staring at the walls and replaying the meeting where they told me the team was being restructured and my role was no longer needed, and I sat there nodding like it was normal while my stomach dropped, and I thought about all the bills that were already late, and how Sarah had said 2 months earlier that she couldn't keep carrying me, and how Mark had started making excuses not to meet up because he was busy with his new position at the other company, the one he got right after they let me go, and it all felt like the world had decided I was done, and I didn't have the energy to fight it anymore. So that night I finally opened the app and put in the address for the pullout, because at least up there it would be quiet and no one would find me until morning if they even bothered looking. The headlights came around the corner a little earlier than the app said, and the car was a black Honda, not silver, but I was already moving toward it before I could second guess because the rain was starting to soak through my jacket, and at that point the color of the car didn't matter anymore. Nothing small like that mattered. I opened the back door, slid in and pulled it shut, and the driver just put it in gear and pulled away without saying anything about the mismatch or asking if I was the right guy. He was older, maybe late 50s, with short graying hair and wire glasses that caught the glow from the dash, and he kept both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 the way some people do when they've been driving long enough to know better. I muttered thanks for coming out this late, and he gave a small nod but kept his eyes on the road as we turned onto the freeway on-ramp, the wipers slapping steady against the light rain that had been coming and going since midnight. For the first stretch, I just stared out the side window watching the exit signs slide by, and my mind kept looping back to the same place as the Zoom meeting where my boss read the script about restructuring and how they muted me when I tried to ask about the final paycheck the last night with Sarah when she said she couldn't do this anymore and left her key on the counter, the way Mark had posted pictures from the new job he got the same week I lost mine like none of it was connected. I kept thinking about how I had spent the afternoon before packing up my desk into that stupid cardboard box they gave me, and how the security guard watched me the whole time like I might steal something on the way out, and how I sat in my car in the parking garage for almost an hour afterward just staring at the steering wheel because going home felt like admitting it was all real. The car was warm enough, but I still felt cold in my chest, the kind that sits there and doesn't go away, no matter how much you shift around in the seat. After maybe 10 minutes, he cleared his throat and asked if the destination on the screen was right, the one up near the forest boundary, and I said yeah, that was fine, and he didn't push it, just kept driving while the city lights started thinning out behind us. He said nights like this the roads feel longer than they are, and I made some sound like agreement because I didn't want to talk, but he kept going in that calm, even tone, saying he had driven a lot of people up this way over the years, people who needed to clear their heads or get away from whatever was waiting at home. I told him it was just a drive, nothing special, and he nodded again like he had heard that before. And then out of nowhere, he asked if the layoff at the tech firm had been as sudden as it sounded on the forums, and I sat up straighter because I hadn't said anything about where I worked or what happened, and the only place I had posted about it was on that one subreddit late one night when I couldn't sleep and the beer was gone. He said he didn't mean to pry, but sometimes passengers leave the app open and details show up, and I felt my stomach tighten because that didn't explain how he knew the exact date or the conference room they used. or the way they cut the video feed right after I asked about Cobra, or how my manager had looked at me with that fake sympathetic face while saying the decision came from higher up and there was nothing he could do, even though I knew he had been the one pushing for the cuts to save his own bonus. He kept driving the turns, getting a little sharper as we left the main highway, and I kept glancing at the mirror trying to see his face better, but the inside light was off and the dashboard only lit the edge of his jaw. The driver said he understood how these things pile up one after another until it feels like there's no air left in the room, and then he mentioned the fight with Sarah, the one where she brought up the credit card I had maxed out trying to keep the apartment going after the first missed paycheck, and how she had said she loved me, but she couldn't watch me sink and take her with me. And I hadn't told anyone about that fight, not even in the subreddit posts I made because it felt too raw and private, but he described it close enough that I started wondering if she had talked to someone, or if the app somehow pulled location data from when we were together, or if this was all some kind of coincidence that was getting too strange to ignore. I asked him how he knew about that, and he said some conversations carry further than people realize, and that he had heard similar stories from other passengers who thought they were alone in it. And I sat there feeling the seatbelt press against my chest a little tighter, wondering if he was just good at guessing, or if there was something else going on that I wasn't seeing yet because the rain was coming down harder now and the road was getting darker and emptier, and part of me wanted to tell him to turn around, but another part was too tired to say the words. We were climbing now, the road narrowing and the trees closing in on both sides, and I checked the app again to see how far we had left, but the signal kept dropping and the estimated time kept jumping around. I told him I thought we were supposed to turn left at the next light, but he said there was construction ahead, and this way cut 10 minutes, and I let it go because arguing felt like too much effort, and my head was already heavy from the last few days of not eating right, and the half bottle I finished before I left the apartment. He started talking again softer this time about how his own kid had been through something similar a few years back, lost the job. Then the relationship then started driving around at night like this, and I asked what the kid did and he said, it took a while, but he came through it, and now they talk every week, even if it's just 5 minutes. The details he dropped next were too close. The girlfriend's name wasn't Sarah, but the way she left the fight about the money, the way the friend stopped answering calls, the exact message Mark sent about how he was sorry, but he had to focus on his own career right now because things were moving fast and he couldn't afford to get dragged down. It was like he had been sitting in my apartment reading my texts, and I kept glancing at the mirror, waiting for him to say something that would make sense of all this. But he just drove with that same steady calm, like he had all the time in the world. I tried to open the app to cancel the ride, but the button wouldn't load, and the battery was draining faster than it should have, and when I looked up we were passing the old office building. I used to work in the lights still on in a few windows, even at this hour, and I wondered if any of the people still there remembered my name or cared that I was gone, or if they had already moved on to the next project like I had never been part of the team. He said quietly that carrying it all alone makes the nights longer, and I told him I was fine really, and he didn't argue, just said he had been there himself once back when his kid was in the same spot, and the only thing that changed anything was someone sitting there and not letting him get out of the car until he talked it through. The pullout was coming up soon. I could see the sign in the headlights and I felt my mouth go dry because this was it, the place I had pictured, the spot where I could just sit on the edge for a while and let the weight do the rest, and no one would know until morning if they even looked. The car slowed and he pulled in and put it in park, but left the engine running and the headlights cutting across the empty gravel and the drop beyond. He turned a little in his seat and said, if I still wanted to get out and walk to the edge, he wouldn't stop me. But he would wait right here until I was ready to go back down, and something in his voice made it sound like he had said those exact words before to someone else who looked a lot like me. I sat there for what felt like a long time, the rain drumming on the roof and my hands shaking in my lap, and I thought about how easy it would be to just open the door and walk the 20 feet to where the gravel ended and the darkness started, and how no one would blame me after everything that had happened because they didn't know how heavy it all felt every single day, the way I woke up and immediately remembered I didn't have anywhere to be, and how the silence in the apartment got louder every hour, and how even the smallest tasks like buying groceries felt pointless because what was the point if I was just going to keep sinking anyway? The driver didn't say anything for a while. He just sat there looking out through the windshield at the rain streaks and the black beyond the headlights, and finally he said that it was okay to not know what to do next, and that sometimes the hardest part was admitting that you didn't want to keep going the way things were, but that didn't mean there wasn't another way, even if it didn't feel like it right then. I told him I didn't know anymore, and he asked about my mom and how she had been trying to reach me, and I said I couldn't talk to her because hearing her voice would make it real. And he nodded and said she was probably sitting up right now worrying and checking her phone every few minutes the way parents do when they sense something is wrong, even if you don't tell them. The more he talked, the more specific he got about things I hadn't shared with anyone, the way I had looked up the bridge near the harbor last week, but decided it was too public, the search history on my laptop for different ways people had done it. The note I started writing 3 different times but deleted because it sounded stupid and selfish, and all of it made my skin feel tight, like the car was getting smaller around me. After another stretch of silence, I said, "Maybe we should head back," and he didn't start the car right away. He just looked at me in the mirror for a second and said he was glad I said that, and that some nights he sits here with people for a long time before they make that choice, and then he put the car in gear and turned around slow on the gravel, the tires crunching loud in the quiet. The ride down felt different. The rain had eased up a little and the city lights started appearing again one by one, and he asked if I wanted to talk more about what was waiting at home, or if I just wanted quiet, and I said, quiet was fine, but then I started talking anyway, rambling about the job applications I had sent out that went unanswered, and the way Sarah had blocked my number after the last argument, and how Mark had liked a post from someone else the other day, like we had never been friends for 6 years. He listened and made small sounds like he was following along, and when I finished he said that none of it defined the whole picture, and that sometimes you need someone outside of it to remind you that the view from the bottom isn't the only one there is. When we pulled up in front of my mom's house in Pasadena, the porch light was on, and she was standing in the doorway in her robe with her arms crossed the way she does when she's worried, and I got out and the driver didn't wait. He just pulled away as soon as the door shut behind me. She hugged me without saying anything at first, and I could feel how thin she had gotten since the last time I saw her, and she kept asking if I was okay, and I kept saying yeah, but my voice didn't sound right even to me. We sat at the kitchen table until the sun started coming up, and I told her some of it, not all of it, and she listened and made coffee and didn't cry until I said, I didn't know how much longer I could keep going like this. The next few days blurred together. I moved some clothes into the spare room, and she didn't ask too many questions at first, just made sure there was food in the fridge, and left the TV on low in the evenings, so the house didn't feel too empty. I started applying for jobs again, the ones I was overqualified for, and the ones I wasn't qualified for at all, and some of them got back to me with the standard rejection emails that still felt like another small punch. Every night I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to my mom breathing in the next room and thinking about the black Honda and how the driver knew things he shouldn't have, and wondering if it had really happened the way I remembered it, or if I had imagined parts of it, because my head was so messed up at the time. I checked the Uber app constantly at first looking for the ride in my history, but it wasn't there anymore, like the system had erased it. And when I searched for black Honda drivers in the area, nothing specific came up, and that made the whole thing feel even stranger, because I could still hear his voice and see the way the glasses caught the light and feel the way the dread had shifted from wanting the drop-off at the pullout to this new quiet fear that someone out there knew exactly how close I had been and had chosen to pull me back without making it a big deal. A week later, I took a short ride to the store, and the driver was a young guy who talked about sports the whole time, and it felt so normal that it almost made the previous ride seem like a dream. But then, late that night when I couldn't sleep, I opened the app again, and there was a new notification for a ride offer from a black Honda 3 minutes away with no name attached, and I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the button, before I closed the app and put the phone in the drawer. The feeling hasn't gone away completely. It sits there in the background like a low hum, and I find myself looking at other drivers a little longer when I get in their cars now, studying their faces and wondering if any of them are the same guy or if they know about me too. My mom and I talk more than we used to, and she told me about how she had been scared for months because my voice sounded different on the phone, and how she had even called some of my old friends to ask if they had heard from me, and I felt bad about that, but also relieved that someone had been paying attention even when I was trying to disappear. Sarah texted me once after I sent her a short message, saying I was sorry for how things ended, and her reply was careful, but not angry, and we have exchanged a few more since then. Nothing deep but enough that it doesn't feel completely cut off anymore. The job search is still slow, but I have an interview next week, and I go to bed before midnight most nights now because the quiet in the old house feels different when someone else is there breathing in the next room. But every once in a while, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I wake up and check the app out of habit, and the screen is blank. And I lie there listening to the rain on the roof, wondering if the black Honda is out there somewhere circling the block, waiting for the next time I stand on a curb with my thumb hovering over the button, because some rides don't really end. They just drop you off at a different address and the driver keeps the meter running in your head long after the car is gone. I don't know if I will ever see him again, or if he was just some guy who has done this before, but the feeling stays with me, the slow, heavy knowledge that someone saw exactly where I was headed and chose to take the long way around until I couldn't go through with it. And that kind of knowing doesn't wash off easy, no matter how many mornings you wake up in your mom's house with coffee already made. I'm typing this now because the library stays open late, and the computer here lets me get some of it out without having to say it out loud to anyone who knows me, and my hands are tired and my eyes are burning, but I need to get it down before I start convincing myself it was all in my head, or that I imagined how much he knew, or that the next ping on the app won't be from him again, because the dread is quieter now. But it is still there, and it makes me wonder how many other people he has picked up on nights like that, and whether any of them are still driving around with the same weight in their chest, wondering if the car will show up again when they need it, or when they don't. I had just finished typing the last reply to a client who kept changing his mind about the project timeline when the group chat started blowing up with messages asking where I was. My friends had been at the rooftop bar for almost 40 minutes already, the new place downtown with the big patio and the heaters that made it feel less like December, and I had told them I would leave the office right after 5, but then one thing led to another, and suddenly it was almost 6:30, so I shut the laptop, grabbed my coat, and ordered the Uber while walking down the stairs, because I was tired of making them wait again, and I knew they would give me shit for it, but at least this time I had a decent excuse, or at least that is what I kept repeating to myself as I hit the sidewalk and the cold air hit my face, making my eyes water a little. The app said the driver was 3 minutes away, so I stood on the curb outside the building watching the little car icon move toward me and trying not to think about how my feet already hurt from the long day, or how my shoulders were tight from hunching over the keyboard, or how I probably smelled like the office coffee that had gone stale hours ago. But none of that mattered because the night was supposed to be about unwinding and catching up and forgetting the deadlines for a few hours at least. The car that pulled up was a silver Camry, a few years old with a dent on the rear bumper, and the driver looked like a regular guy in his late 40s wearing a faded black hoodie and glasses that sat crooked on his face. And I remember noticing right away how the interior light was off, so his face stayed mostly in shadow, except for the glow from the dashboard that caught the edge of his jaw, and the way his hands rested on the wheel like he had done this 1,000 times before. His name on the app was listed as Keith, and he had a high rating from thousands of rides, so I figured it would be a quick trip, and I got in the back seat, told him good evening, and gave the address again, even though the app already had it, and he just nodded once without saying anything, then pulled away from the curb. The traffic was lighter than I expected, which was good, because I was already imagining the first drink I would order, and how the guys would be halfway through their second round by the time I got there, and how Caleb would probably make some joke about me finally showing up, and how we would laugh it off and move on to talking about the usual stuff, work, gripes, sports, whatever came up. For the first few minutes, I scrolled through my phone answering a couple more work messages and sending a text to the group saying I was finally on the way, and Caleb replied with the laughing emoji and something about how I was always late, but they saved me a seat anyway, and I smiled at that because it felt normal and familiar, and I needed normal after the kind of day I had. I didn't notice anything off at first. The driver kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes straight ahead, and I was grateful for the quiet because my head was still buzzing from the day with all the little details swirling around like the client's latest email that I had to reread 3 times to make sure I wasn't missing another change, or the way my boss had looked at me during the afternoon stand-up, like he was wondering if I was burning out, but didn't want to say it out loud. But after we passed the usual turnoff for downtown, I looked up and asked if the GPS was taking us the right way because it seemed like we were heading more east than we should. And he didn't answer right away, just made a small sound, like he was clearing his throat, and said there was construction on the main route. So this way was better, and I checked the app again, and the estimated arrival time had gone from 12 minutes to 24, and the blue line on the map was taking us through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, so I told myself it was probably fine. some drivers know shortcuts that save time even if they look longer on the screen. And I went back to my phone trying to relax by scrolling through some photos from the weekend before. But my mind kept drifting back to the route and how the buildings outside were starting to look less familiar, and how the streetlights seemed spaced farther apart now. The silence in the car started to feel heavier after that, and I tried making conversation, asking how long he had been driving for Uber and whether he liked the night shifts, but he just gave another one of those small nods and kept driving, and his eyes would flick up to the rearview mirror every so often, not long enough to be obvious at first, but enough that I noticed, and I shifted in the seat and looked out the window at the houses sliding past, thinking about how I needed to stop agreeing to after-work drinks when I was already wiped out, because it always ended up like this, me rushing and them waiting. And then I heard it for the first time, a low thump from behind me like something heavy moving in the trunk when we went over a rough patch in the road. And it wasn't loud, but it was distinct, and it made me sit up a little straighter because it didn't sound like a spare tire or groceries. It sounded deliberate, like whatever was back there had shifted on purpose. And maybe it was a toolbox sliding or a bag of groceries, but the timing felt off because it happened right after we hit the bump and then nothing for a few seconds, and I waited for it to happen again, and sure enough, after the next turn, there it was the same muffled thump, followed by a softer sound, almost like fabric shifting or someone adjusting their position, and my mind started turning over possibilities. Maybe he had a dog back there or some equipment for a side job. Or maybe it was just the way the car was loaded, but the more I listened, the less those explanations felt right because the sound had a rhythm to it, like something alive trying to find a comfortable spot, and I kept telling myself over and over that I was just exhausted and reading too much into ordinary car noises. But the doubt kept creeping back stronger each time, and I glanced at the driver in the mirror and caught him watching me again. His expression blank behind the glasses, and I noticed how his fingers started tapping lightly on the steering wheel in a pattern that matched the thumps almost exactly. And that made my throat tighten because it could have been coincidence, but it felt too precise, and I tried to swallow, but my mouth had gone completely dry. I asked if everything was okay with the car because I thought I heard something in the back, and he didn't respond, just reached over and turned on the radio to some talk station with the volume low at first, and the hosts were arguing about traffic or politics or something I didn't care about. But it filled the space enough that the thumping became harder to hear unless I really focused on it, and I kept telling myself to stop being paranoid because it was probably nothing, and I was just tired and overthinking after a long day. But then we kept going, and the neighborhoods got quieter, the streets narrower, and I checked the app for the third time, and now the arrival was showing 38 minutes, and the route had us looping around in a way that didn't make any sense for getting to the bar. So I said, "Hey, I think we might be going the long way. Can we head back toward the freeway?" And he finally spoke again, saying the GPS knew best, and there was no point arguing with it, and his voice was flat, like he was reading from a script, and it didn't make me feel any better. I texted Caleb quickly saying the driver was taking some weird route and I might be a few more minutes. And he replied asking if everything was all right, and I said, yeah, just traffic. But inside I was starting to feel that twist in my stomach, the one that comes when something small keeps adding up and you try to tell yourself you're overreacting, but the feeling won't go away, and the thumping came again louder this time, and then a new sound, a faint muffled noise that could have been a cough or a moan or maybe just the radio static, but it didn't sound mechanical, and it had a pattern now, like 2 quick knocks, then a pause, then another. And I sat there trying to decide what to do because part of me wanted to demand he pull over right then, but another part kept saying, what if it was nothing, and I made a big deal out of it and ended up looking like an idiot or worse, making the driver angry for no reason. And I watched his hands on the wheel. They were steady, but his fingers tapped occasionally, like he was nervous or impatient, and every few minutes he would adjust the mirror slightly so he could see me better, and the talk radio was louder now, and I wondered if he had turned it up on purpose to cover the sounds from the trunk, because whenever the thumping got stronger, he would reach over and increase the volume a little more, and I noticed how he cleared his throat twice in a row right after one of the knocks, like he was trying to mask it, and my mouth felt dry all of a sudden, and my vision started to tunnel a bit around the edges the way it does when your body knows something is wrong before your brain catches up, and I tried to call Caleb right then, but the signal bars kept dropping to nothing, and the call wouldn't go through no matter how many times I tapped the screen, and that made the panic rise a little higher, because I was completely cut off and alone with this guy who wouldn't answer a single direct question. I asked him straight out what was in the trunk, because I could hear something moving back there, and he didn't even turn his head, just said it was his personal stuff, and to mind my own business in that same flat tone that made the hairs on my arms stand up, and by then we had been in the car for almost 40 minutes and the bar was nowhere in sight, and the streets looked completely unfamiliar. like we had left the city proper and were in some industrial area with warehouses and empty lots, and my phone signal was spotty, and the Uber map kept freezing, and I started thinking about all the stories you hear about drivers who go off route for whatever reason, and how most of the time it turns out to be nothing, but sometimes it doesn't. And I told him I needed to get out, that I would walk the rest of the way or call another ride, and he ignored me completely, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, and the sounds from the trunk were more frequent now. Not just thumps, but something that sounded like scraping, and once a weak cry that was cut off almost immediately, like someone trying to call out but couldn't get enough air, and then it came again, a little clearer, almost like a muffled word, but I couldn't make it out over the radio, and my heart was beating harder, and my hands were starting to sweat because I couldn't keep pretending it was nothing anymore. I said it louder this time. "Pull over now, I want out of the car," and he finally looked at me in the mirror, his face still blank. But there was something in his eyes that made me wish I hadn't said anything, and he slowed down a little but didn't stop, and I could see a gas station up ahead with lights on and a couple cars parked out front. So I told him to pull in there, and he did, after a long pause like he was considering it, and the car rolled to a stop near the pumps, and I didn't wait for him to say anything. I grabbed my bag, pushed the door open, and got out fast, my legs feeling shaky on the concrete, and I walked straight toward the store without looking back, and only when I was inside under the bright lights did I turn around and see the Camry still sitting there with the driver watching me through the window, and I asked the guy behind the counter if I could use the phone to call the police, and he looked at me strange but handed it over, and I explained what happened as best I could, the wrong route, the sounds, the way the driver wouldn't talk or stop. The police came about 20 minutes later, and I gave them all the details, the driver's name on the app, the car description, the license plate I had managed to read when I got out, and they took a report and said they would look into it, and one of them drove me the rest of the way to the bar, where my friends were waiting looking worried because I had stopped answering texts, and I told them some of it. Not everything, because I didn't want to ruin the night completely, but I could tell they were shaken by it too, and we stayed for a couple hours, but I couldn't really enjoy myself. My mind kept going back to those sounds and what they might have meant. It has been a few months now, and I still haven't heard anything back from the police when I call to follow up. They say the investigation is ongoing, but they can't give details, and the driver's profile disappeared from the app a few days after that night, and when I search for similar cars or names, nothing comes up, and I stopped using Uber altogether after that because the thought of getting into another stranger's car late at night makes my chest tight in a way that doesn't go away easy. I am typing this now at 3 in the morning on the library computer because I still can't sleep without hearing that thump, and I needed to get it out before it eats me alive. I had just dragged myself out of the warehouse after pulling a double shift because 2 guys called out sick and they needed someone to stay, and I was too tired to argue with the supervisor when the last bus had already left and my usual taxi driver wasn't answering, so I finally downloaded the Uber app like everyone kept telling me to and requested a ride home, even though it felt strange letting a complete stranger drive me at 1 in the morning. My eyes were burning and my back felt like someone had taken a hammer to it, and all I could think about was getting horizontal on my couch for a few hours before I had to be back for the next shift. The car that pulled up was a dark blue sedan, nothing special, and the driver was a middle-aged guy with a baseball cap pulled low who didn't say much when I got in the back seat, just grunted when I told him the address and started driving, so I leaned my head against the window and let the motion of the car start to pull me under, because I figured a 10-minute ride wasn't long enough to worry about falling asleep, and my whole body was so heavy from the 16 hours on concrete that the seat felt like it was swallowing me, and the heater was blowing this warm, stale air that made my eyelids droop even faster. And I kept telling myself just a quick nap wouldn't hurt, and the driver would wake me when we got there, and I wouldn't have to deal with the cold walk from the bus stop or the ache in my knees or the fact that I had to be back in less than 6 hours. But the exhaustion was so deep that I didn't even hear the turn signal or feel the car change lanes. I just slipped under completely, and the world faded out in that way it does when you've been on your feet for that long and your mind finally gives up. I don't remember much of the beginning of the trip. 1 minute we were still in the industrial part of town with the streetlights flashing past, and the next thing I knew I was jolting awake because the car hit a big bump and my head smacked against the glass, hard enough to make my ears ring, and my neck throbbed where it had been at an awkward angle, and for a second I couldn't remember where I was or why I was in a car at all, and then it came back: the warehouse, the double shift, the Uber, and I rubbed my eyes trying to clear the fog, and that's when the confusion hit because the clock on the dash said almost 3:30, and that couldn't be right because the ride was supposed to be 10 minutes, and I had only closed my eyes for what felt like a minute or two, and the outside was pitch black with nothing but trees pressing close to the road, and the only illumination came from the headlights cutting a narrow path ahead, and I sat up straighter, blinking hard, trying to get my bearings. And when I looked at the clock again, it still said 3:30, and my stomach started to twist because my apartment was only a few miles from the warehouse, and we should have been there already, and the road kept winding deeper into the forest. And I asked the driver where we were and if we missed the exit. But he didn't answer, just kept his hands at 10 and 2 and stared straight ahead, like I hadn't said anything at all. And I could feel my heart starting to pick up because the air in the car felt thicker now, like it had been closed up for hours. And there was this faint stale smell like old coffee, and something else I couldn't place. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the back seat anymore. There was someone sitting right next to me, a woman maybe in her 30s with straight hair hanging in her face and wearing a thin jacket that looked too light for the cold. And she hadn't been there when I fell asleep, I was sure of it. Because I had the whole seat to myself, and now she was pressed close enough that I could smell something faint like soap and sweat mixed together. And her skin looked pale in the dim light from the dash, and her eyes were open, but they had this flat, empty look like she was staring through me instead of at me. And when I asked who she was and what the hell was going on, she turned her head slowly and said in a quiet monotone that he had other plans for me now, and that we were almost at the new place, and the way she said it, so calm, like it was the most normal thing in the world, made my stomach drop even lower, and I looked at the driver again and asked him to pull over right now, but neither of them reacted. They just kept driving deeper into the trees, and the road kept getting narrower until it felt like the forest was swallowing us, and I could feel the cold from her side of the seat seeping over, and my hands started to feel clammy, and I kept shifting away from her. But there wasn't much room, and every time I moved, she would lean a little closer like she was making sure I couldn't get away. I kept talking, trying to keep my voice steady, telling them I needed to get home and that this wasn't the right way, and that I would call someone if they didn't stop. But the words felt useless, bouncing around in the quiet car, and the woman next to me reached over and touched my arm lightly. Her fingers cold and dry and rough like they hadn't seen lotion in weeks, and she said I didn't need to worry anymore because the provider took care of everyone who came to him, and that I looked like I needed rest and a new start, just like she did. And her touch made my skin crawl, but I didn't pull away right away, because I was still trying to figure out if this was some kind of sick joke, or if I was still half asleep and imagining it, and I asked her again who the provider was and what new place she meant, and she just kept smiling this small, tired smile and repeated that fighting only made the transition harder, and that he would make everything better once we got there. And I could see faint bruises on her wrists when the headlights caught them, just for a second. And the way she kept patting my leg like I was a child throwing a tantrum while saying these things made the dread settle heavy in my chest, like something I couldn't shake off, and my mouth went completely dry, and I tried to grab for the door handle, but it was locked, and when I asked to unlock it, the driver just sped up a little and hummed this tuneless song under his breath like he couldn't hear me. The road kept winding, and I lost track of how long we had been driving, but it felt like forever. And my phone had no signal out here, so I couldn't call anyone or even check the map, and every time I asked again to stop, the woman would pat my leg like I was a child throwing a tantrum and say the provider didn't like when people fought it, and that fighting only made the transition harder, and I started bargaining, telling them I had cash on me and I would pay them extra just to turn around, but they acted like they couldn't hear me anymore. The driver humming louder now, and the woman staring at the side of my face with those blank eyes, and I tried to open the app to cancel the ride. But the screen wouldn't load and the battery was draining faster than it should have, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, and the cold from her side was making my arm go numb where she kept touching it, and I kept thinking about how I had almost not taken the ride, and how I could have walked the 2 miles home even if it was cold, and how stupid I had been to fall asleep, and how no one knew where I was, and the fear wasn't loud or sudden, it just kept growing steady and thick until it felt like I couldn't breathe right, and my hands were shaking in my lap because I knew we were getting farther and farther from anywhere I recognized, and I kept picturing my apartment sitting empty with the lights off, and no one knowing where I was, or that I had even taken this ride, and I tried one more time to yell at the driver to stop, and the woman just leaned closer and whispered that the provider had chosen me because I looked so tired, and that he would fix that forever. When the red and blue lights finally appeared behind us, flashing in the rear view, I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time since I woke up. The driver slowed down and pulled over onto the shoulder without saying anything, and the woman next to me went completely still like someone had flipped a switch. The state trooper walked up to the window and asked for license and registration in that bored cop voice, and the driver handed them over without argument. I tried to catch the officer's eye in the side mirror, willing him to look at me and see how wrong this all was, and when he finally leaned down and shined his light into the back seat, I must have looked as desperate as I felt because he paused for a long second, then told the driver to step out of the car. They talked for a minute on the side of the road, and then the trooper came back and opened the rear door and told me to get out because there was a warrant matching my description from a nearby county and he needed to take me in for questioning. It was obviously bullshit, but I didn't argue. I just slid out fast and let him cuff me and put me in the back of the patrol car, while the driver and the woman sat there in the sedan watching us with those same flat expressions, and I could still feel their eyes on me even as the trooper closed the door and the patrol car started to move away. The trooper didn't say much until we were a few miles down the road, then he asked me what the hell was going on back there, and I told him everything in a rush, the sleeping the wrong road, the woman who appeared out of nowhere, the things she said about the provider, and he listened without interrupting and said he had a bad feeling the second he saw my face in the mirror. He called for backup to check on the sedan and told me they would make sure I got home safe, but that I needed to be careful because people like that sometimes operated in groups and they knew how to find addresses. I sat in the back of that patrol car, shaking the whole way back to town, and when he finally dropped me off at my building, he waited until I was inside before driving away. I didn't sleep that night, or the next one either. I kept checking the locks and looking out the window every time I heard a car pass. The Uber app still shows the ride as completed with a 5-star rating from the driver, but the woman's name was never listed anywhere, and when I tried to report it, the support team said there was no record of any additional passenger. I haven't taken another Uber since, and I probably never will. I was still at the bar nursing the last whiskey and coke when Rachel said she had to go because the hospital called about her mom falling again, and I told her it was fine. I would just grab an Uber home because the promotion had finally come through after they let Mike go last month for all the complaints that kept stacking up, and I was feeling too good to end the night early, even though my head was already fuzzy from the shots and the dancing and the way the whole team had toasted me like I'd earned it after covering his messes for so long. She gave me that look like she wasn't sure, but I waved her off and said I would text when I got in, and then she was gone. And I ordered one more drink because why not? I had put in the hours and dealt with his attitude, and now the district manager title was mine and the bar was warm and loud and I didn't want to go back to my empty apartment yet, so I sat there scrolling through my phone until the Uber notification popped up saying the driver was 8 minutes away, and I finished the drink and stepped outside into the cool air to wait because the spins were starting. But I figured the ride would be short and I could sleep it off once I got home. The car that pulled up was a gray SUV with tinted windows, and the driver was a guy in his 40s with a beard and a hoodie pulled up, and he didn't say much when I climbed into the back seat, just asked if the temperature was okay and started the route. So I mumbled the address and leaned my head against the window because the whiskey was hitting harder now and the motion of the car felt nice after the noise of the bar, and my eyes kept drifting shut even though I told myself to stay awake because I was alone with a stranger, but the exhaustion from the long week and the celebration mixed together, and I figured a quick nap wouldn't hurt since the app said 25 minutes back to my place in the suburbs. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up the clock on the dash said almost 3. And the road looked wrong because we were heading north on the highway away from the city instead of east toward my apartment, and the streetlights were gone, and there were only dark fields and trees sliding past, and I sat up fast and asked the driver if he had the address right, and he said, yeah, it's in the app, and I checked my phone, but the signal was weak, and the map wouldn't load, and I told him to turn around because this was the wrong way, and he didn't answer, just kept driving with both hands on the wheel and the radio playing low some old country song I didn't recognize. I kept talking, trying to keep my voice steady, telling him I lived in the opposite direction and that I needed to get home soon because I had an early meeting, but he stayed quiet for a long stretch. And then he asked how the new district manager position was treating me, and I felt my stomach twist because no random driver would know that detail. And I asked how he knew about the promotion, and he said word gets around in small circles, and then he mentioned the exact date they announced it and the way Mike had been walked out the door and the complaints from the interns. and I started to feel the dread settle in slow because his voice sounded familiar now, like I had heard it in meetings. And when I looked at the mirror, I caught the side of his face, and the beard was new, but the eyes were the same, and it was Mike, my old boss, the one they fired right before they gave me his job, and my mouth went dry, and I told him to pull over right now, but he just sped up a little and said we needed to talk about how I had been gunning for his position for months, and how I was the one who always stayed late, and smiled at the regional manager, and he had seen the emails, and I said that wasn't true. The complaints came from multiple people, but he just shook his head and kept driving deeper into the dark, like he had all the time in the world. The ride went on for what felt like hours, with him talking the whole time in that calm, steady way about how the company had screwed him over, and how I had taken everything: his salary, his respect, his future. And now I was going to understand what it felt like to lose control, and I kept trying to reason with him, saying I didn't do anything, but he would just sigh and say, I didn't have to lie to myself anymore. And the road kept getting narrower until it turned to gravel, and the trees closed in on both sides, and I tried the door handle, but it was locked and the child lock was on, and I started feeling the panic build slow and heavy because there was no traffic and no way to call for help, and my phone was dead now, and he pulled off onto a dirt track, and the house that appeared at the end was old and dark with no lights on anywhere, and when the car finally stopped, he turned around and said we were home now, and that I could stay until I understood what I had done, and I begged him to let me go, but he just got out and opened the back door and took my arm and led me inside without forcing it hard, but the way he held on made it clear there was no choice, and the house smelled like dust and old wood, and he put me in a small room with a mattress on the floor and a tiny window high up on the wall, and locked the door from the outside and said he would bring water later, and that we had plenty of time to talk. The first day blurred together because the hangover mixed with the fear made everything feel thick and slow, and he would come in every few hours and give me water and some crackers and sit on the chair by the door talking for long stretches about the old office and the meetings and how I had ruined it all with my ambition, and every time I tried to explain that I had nothing to do with the firing, he would just nod like he had heard it before and say the truth would come out eventually, and the isolation made the dread worse because there was no clock, and the light from the small window was the only way to tell day from night. And I spent hours staring at it, trying to figure out how long I had been there, and whether anyone had noticed I was missing yet. And Stacy had texted me a few times before I left the bar, but I hadn't answered because I was drunk, and now I kept thinking about how she would assume I just went home and crashed and wouldn't start worrying until the next day, or maybe even later. On the second day, he started getting more talkative, bringing down a folding chair and explaining his plan like he was proud of it, how he had created a fake Uber profile using an old ID, and how he had been waiting outside the bar because he knew I would stay late celebrating, and how easy it had been to get me into the car once I was drunk and alone. And he said he had been watching me for weeks after they fired him, learning my routines and where I went after work, and that the call to Rachel's phone had been his idea too, so I would be isolated, and he wanted me to feel what it felt like to have everything taken away, and I tried to reason with him, telling him I would quit the job and tell the company they made a mistake. But he just laughed softly and said it was too late for that because this wasn't about the job anymore. It was about balance and making things right, and the dread kept growing because he never raised his voice, and he always locked the door carefully when he left, and the house above me sounded empty, like there were no neighbors close enough to hear anything, and my wrists were raw from the zip ties he used when he left the room, and the thirst was constant even though he gave me water because the fear made my mouth dry. The third morning he came down and said I could use the bathroom if I promised to behave. And he cut the ties on my ankles but left my hands bound and walked me upstairs to a small bathroom with a window that was painted shut, and he stood outside the door while I used the toilet and washed my face, and I could see him through the crack watching the handle to make sure I didn't try anything. And that's when I noticed the old metal towel rod on the wall. It was loose and heavy, and I didn't plan it out. I just knew this might be my only chance, so I made noise like I was washing my hands, and then I grabbed the rod, and when he opened the door to check on me, I swung it as hard as I could, catching him on the side of the head. And he went down hard, and I didn't stop to check if he was unconscious. I just ran, and the house was bigger than I thought, and I had to search for the front door, and when I found it, it was dead-bolted with a chain and I couldn't get it open. So I went back upstairs and found a bedroom window that opened onto the roof of the porch, and I climbed out and dropped down into the yard, and then I ran. And the property was surrounded by woods and fields, and I had no idea where I was, but I kept running until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. And then I walked until I found a road, and a delivery truck driver eventually stopped when he saw me waving from the shoulder, and I told him enough of what happened that he drove me straight to the sheriff's station in the next town. The police took my statement and sent people out to the house, but when they got there, it was empty. Mike was gone, and there was no sign of the gray SUV or any of the things he had described, and the Uber app showed the ride as completed. But the driver name was blank, and there was no charge on my card. And when they looked into it, the support team said there was no record of that trip at all. And they told me they would keep looking, but weeks went by, and there were no updates, and I moved to a new apartment and changed my number and tried to go back to work, but every time I saw a gray SUV, my hands would start shaking, and I would have to pull over until the feeling passed. And I hadn't opened the Uber app in months until yesterday. I was sitting on my couch when the notification came through. Your ride has arrived, and the driver name underneath it was Mike, and the little car icon showed it was parked right outside my building, and I am typing this now at the library, because I can't stay in my apartment anymore. And I don't know what to do next, but I needed to get it out because the dread is back, and it feels exactly like it did in that room when I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs. I was still feeling the warm edges of the edibles when we climbed into the back of the Uber outside the bar because Marcus and I had split a couple gummies earlier to take the edge off the long week, and the music inside had been loud enough to make everything feel loose and easy, and I figured the ride home would be the perfect wind-down before I crashed on my couch for the weekend. The driver was a woman maybe in her late 30s with her hair pulled back tight and a plain black jacket, and she looked tired the way night drivers do. But she smiled when we got in and said the address was already in the app, so I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes for a second because the high was sitting nice and steady in my chest, and Marcus was already scrolling through his phone in the seat next to me, muttering about how the party had been better than expected. The car pulled away smooth, and the city lights slid past the windows, and for the first stretch, everything felt normal enough that I almost dozed off again. But then the driver cleared her throat and asked if we had been out celebrating something, and I told her, yeah, my birthday. And she nodded and said nights like this were the hardest because everyone was out having fun while she was stuck driving strangers around, and I made some sympathetic sound because I didn't want to be rude, but my mind was already drifting back to the gummy and how the colors on the passing signs looked a little brighter than usual, and the way the streetlights seemed to leave soft trails when I blinked, and the high made the heater air feel thicker and warmer against my skin. She kept talking after that in this calm, steady way about how the app tracked everything and how she had started noticing patterns on her longer shifts, like the same cars showing up in her rear view or people who looked too ordinary, and I laughed a little, thinking it was small talk. But she didn't laugh back, and instead said she had been followed before and that they knew how to blend in. And Marcus glanced at me in the dark back seat like he was wondering if I heard it too, and I asked her who she meant by they. And she said the ones who watch and switch out the real people when no one is looking, and her voice stayed even, like she was explaining the weather, but the words landed heavy in the quiet car, and I felt the first real twist in my stomach because the high was making it harder to tell if she was joking or if the way she gripped the wheel a little tighter meant something else. And I kept telling myself it was just the edibles amplifying everything, and that she was probably just tired and venting after a long shift, but the way her eyes kept flicking to the mirrors made the twist in my gut stay there and grow a little heavier. The route on my phone showed we should have turned left at the next light to head toward the suburbs, but she kept going straight, and when I pointed it out, she said the main roads were monitored tonight, and this way was safer, and I checked the app again, and the estimated time had jumped from 20 minutes to 40. And the blue line was taking us north toward the industrial edge of town, where the warehouses sit dark after midnight, and the high made the dashboard glow look softer, and the numbers on the clock seemed to pulse a little. And I tried to focus on breathing slow, because I didn't want Marcus to see how the gummies were starting to mix with the unease in a way that made my thoughts feel sticky. I tried to keep my voice casual, telling her the app said the other way was faster, but she just shook her head and said the app didn't know what was really going on, and that they used it to track people, and Marcus shifted in his seat and asked if everything was okay, because we really needed to get home, and she said we would get there eventually, but first she needed to make sure no one was behind us, and then she started checking the mirrors every few seconds, and slowing down, then speeding up again. And the high that had felt warm and easy a few minutes earlier was starting to feel thick and heavy, like it was pressing on my thoughts and making it harder to decide what to say next, because part of me still wanted to believe this was just a weird driver having a bad night, but another part was noticing how empty the road was getting and how the streetlights were farther apart now, and how her hands never left the wheel at 10 and 2, like she was holding on for something bigger than traffic, and I could feel my pulse in my ears now steady and a little too loud, and the gummies made every small sound in the car feel sharper, the click of the turn signal, the soft hum of the tires, the way her breathing changed when she glanced back at us. She asked if we worked in tech or anything like that, and when I said no, just regular jobs. She made this small sound, like she didn't quite believe me, and started talking about how they replace people who ask too many questions, and how she had seen it happen to her old roommate. And the details she dropped were too specific, the exact company name, the floor the roommate worked on, and I felt my mouth go dry because none of that had come up in conversation, and the only way she could know was if she had looked us up or if this was something she had been building in her head for a while, and the high made the story feel like it was wrapping around my brain slower and stickier, and I kept trying to laugh it off inside my head, but the laugh wouldn't stick because her tone never changed and her eyes in the mirror kept locking on mine for half a second too long. The car kept going, and the city fell away completely until there were only trees and chain-link fences and the occasional flickering security light, and I kept checking my phone, but the signal kept dropping and the Uber map froze on the same spot, and I told her again that we really needed to turn around because this wasn't the way, and she said turning around would only make them notice us more, and that she had done this before and knew how to lose them, and her voice stayed calm the whole time like she was giving directions to a friend. But her eyes in the mirror looked too wide and too focused, and every time a car passed us in the opposite lane, she would tense up and mutter something about spotters, and Marcus tried to joke about it saying we were just regular guys heading home, but she didn't smile, and instead asked if we had posted anything online about where we were going tonight, and when I said no, she nodded, like that was the right answer, and then she started flashing the turn signal left and right over and over, even though we weren't changing lanes, and I asked why she was doing that, and she said it confused the trackers because they expected normal signals, and the high made the clicking sound of the blinker feel louder than it should have, and the dread kept building in these long quiet stretches where no one spoke, and the only sound was the tires on the asphalt and her breathing, which had started to come a little faster, like she was working up to something, and I could feel Marcus's leg bouncing next to mine now, and the gummies made the bouncing feel like it was vibrating through the whole seat and into my own body. After what felt like another 20 minutes, she pulled off the main road onto a service lane that ran behind some old warehouses, and the gravel crunched under the tires, and I said, "Hey, this really isn't the way." And she put the car in park but left the engine running and turned around in her seat and looked at us both for a long moment and said she needed us to prove we weren't with them, and that she couldn't risk taking us any farther until she was sure. And Marcus tried to laugh it off, saying we were just passengers, but she didn't laugh, and instead reached into the center console and pulled out a small flashlight and shined it in our faces one at a time, and asked us to say our full names and where we worked, and the questions kept coming faster, and her voice stayed level, but her hands were shaking a little now, and the high made the inside of the car feel too small and too bright from the dashboard glow, and I could feel my heart beating in my throat because the doors were still locked, and there was no one else around, and she kept saying she had to be careful because they had taken her sister last year and replaced her with someone who looked exactly the same, and the details she gave about her sister were too personal. The birthday, the favorite song the way she used to call every Sunday, and I realized this wasn't a game or a joke. This was something that had been living in her head for a long time, and it had finally found us in the back seat of her car on a dark service road with no signal and no way out except through whatever she decided next, and the edibles made every second stretch out. So the fear had time to settle deeper and wrap tighter around my chest. She kept the light on us for what felt like forever, asking more questions about who we knew and what we had posted online. And every time we answered, she would nod slowly like she was checking against some list in her mind, and Marcus tried to talk her down, saying we could just end the ride and she could keep the fare, but she said ending the ride would alert them and that she needed to drive us somewhere safe first, and then she put the car back in gear and started moving again deeper into the industrial lots, and the dread had become this constant heavy thing that made it hard to think straight, because the edibles had slowed my reactions and the fear kept looping in my head that if I pushed too hard, she might do something sudden. And if I stayed quiet, we might end up even farther out. And I kept glancing at Marcus, and he kept glancing at me, and we both knew we were in the same slow, unraveling situation with no easy exit. She pulled into an empty parking lot behind a boarded-up building and turned off the headlights and sat there for a long minute with the engine still running and said she needed us to empty our pockets so she could check for trackers, and I felt my stomach drop because this was the moment it stopped being just words and started being something I didn't know how to talk my way out of, and the high made the whole scene feel dreamlike and too sharp at the same time. And I could see Marcus's hands shaking in his lap, and I started talking as calm as I could, saying we didn't have anything like that, and that we just wanted to go home. And she listened for a while, but then she said she had heard that before, and that they always sounded normal at first, and her voice cracked a little on the last part, and that small break in her calm made the fear spike higher because it meant she was close to whatever edge she had been walking all night, and the gummies made the crack in her voice echo in my head longer than it should have, and I could feel the sweat starting on my back, even though the car wasn't hot anymore. I don't remember exactly how we got out of the car because the next few minutes are still blurry from the gummies and the panic. But I know Marcus suddenly opened the door on his side, and I followed fast, and we both started walking away from the SUV toward the streetlights we could see in the distance, and she called after us saying it wasn't safe to walk. But she didn't get out of the car, and after a minute we heard the engine rev, and the SUV pulled away fast, and we kept walking until we reached a gas station that was still open, and the clerk let us use the phone, and we called a regular taxi this time, and the whole ride back to my place. I kept checking over my shoulder even though there was nothing there, and Marcus didn't say much either. And when we finally got inside, I locked the door, and we both sat on the couch until the sun came up, because neither of us wanted to be alone with the way her eyes had looked in the mirror, or the way she had talked about trackers like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The Uber app showed the ride as completed with a 5-star rating from her, but when I tried to report it, the support team said there was no record of that trip, and the driver profile I remembered was gone the next day, and I haven't opened the app since. And every time I see a gray SUV on the road, my chest tightens in that same slow, heavy way, and I wonder if she is still out there driving nights and checking mirrors and waiting for the next passengers who look like they might know something, and the thought sits with me quiet and constant, like the gummies never fully wore off. And I am typing this now at 3 in the morning on the library computer, because I still can't sleep without hearing the blinker clicking left and right over and over, and I needed to get it out before the dread starts feeling normal.